Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Stoa. Peter Limberg, the steward of the Stoa. And the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today is the launch of a new series, which I'm quite excited about, Stoic Provocations or Provocations. So this is a new series, and I'll read the blurb, which affords us to practice our Stoicism. A speaker visits us, shares some edgy thoughts that puts us at the edge of our thinking. We possibly get triggered, we stop the recording, and then we get into collective dialogue with a little twist. And so how this is going to work, there's going to be two parts to this. The first part, our guest, a visitor, which I'll introduce in a moment, will share their thoughts on the topic at hand for 10 to 20 minutes. And when they're sharing their topic, we are going to, in the chats, put one of the four following things. We can do all four of them, and I'll put them in the chats right now. Write down what propositions you agree with, what propositions you disagree with, what triggered you, or what came alive. You can put that down anytime you're listening to our guest speak. But the twist is this too. We're all going to change our names in Zoom right now to the same name. So it's going to be anonymous who is saying what. So the name we're going to change to, let's just put Marcus, our boy Marcus Aurelius. So you can do that by going to the participants thing. You rename, and then just put Marcus, capital M, there. So everyone's name is going to be Marcus. And then in the chats, when you're writing down what you agree with, disagree with, what came alive, or what triggered you, we won't know who said it, but we know what is out there in the field, what the collective intelligence is thinking about. So if everyone can go ahead, change the name to Marcus. There we go. I don't want to make a cult joke right now, but a Stoic cult joke. And yeah, make sure it's the capital M too. So there's no, we know, so everyone's the same. And don't get creative there. So I'll let everyone change that. Cool. So after the first portion, after the guest comes, shares their thoughts for 10, 20 minutes, we'll pause, do a little meditation break, and we'll engage in a collective conversation. And the recording button will be stopped at that second portion. I'll explain more about that when we get there. So for now, I'll introduce my guest, or our guest, Jane Gatsby. She runs this new podcast called Wonderland, and has put a lot of thought into social science and the problem of it. So she's going to present the problem with social science. So I will hand it off to Jane right now, and Jane can share her thoughts. Welcome to the Stoa. I think you can unmute yourself now. Yeah.
Oh. Hi, guys. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited to share some controversial ideas. Hopefully, develop my own thinking a little bit, further some other people's. I'm going to be talking about the beef I have with social science. For a tiny bit of context, I have an undergrad degree in political science and psychology. And the only thing I learned throughout that course was getting more skeptical about the things I was learning rather than more passionate about them. Let's get into it. The first thing I want to just lay out is what I'm talking about when I say science, because there's lots of different competing definitions, and I don't want to get confused right off the hop about what we're talking about. I'm referring specifically to information that's acquired through the scientific method. So this being the standardized process of collecting and analyzing data to generate predictive results, usually by using experiments where variables can be controlled and manipulated to identify cause and effect relationships. Now, in the natural world, this process has worked quite well. Physicists, chemists, and biologists have all been able to use scientific experiments to gain meaningful knowledge about the natural world. And we have the scientific method to thank for much of the progress we've seen in the past few hundred years. So it makes sense that social theorists would try to replicate the success of the science in the social realm. and replicate they have. Nowadays, psychological, sociological, and political research is dominated by studies, correlations, and statistics. They make up the basis of psychology textbooks, social theories, and much of modern political debate. There's only one problem. I don't think it's working. So let me give you some examples. Starting with statistics, I hope we're all familiar with stats. These are numerical measures of some social variable, usually collected through census data or large-scale surveys. And people love throwing around statistics to make an argument. We're all familiar with the numbers associated with things like the wage gap, wealth inequality, or police brutality. But the only problem is that statistics alone don't actually say anything meaningful about the phenomena they describe. They must be contextualized into a broader framework that allows you to make sense of them. So for instance, the same piece of evidence that, like for instance, a woman makes 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, could be used to support a feminist argument demonstrating sexism in the workplace, or an evolutionary psychologist's position that men and women simply have different career interests. It doesn't actually matter what the statistic says, it's a matter of how it's framed. Another example would be the fact that the top 1% of income earners hold 50% of the wealth. That is in and of itself a value neutral statement, but if you start with the belief that economic inequality presents a problem to society, then it's going to seem like an issue. But those sorts of conclusions can't be reached through statistical analysis alone. So the second model often employed by social science is correlational research, where you take two data sets and analyze them to infer a causal relationship. As most people know, the problem with correlational research is that while any causal relationship can be demonstrated through correlational data, correlation alone does not indicate causation. Even when two variables are related, this may be due to a third variable that has not been accounted for, or both variables may be indirect measures of the same underlying concept. Moreover, the vast majority of correlational research is used to conform common sense associations rather than discover surprising ones. So, like, I remember seeing some study that was talking about how there's a positive correlation empirically demonstrated between reading and vocabulary size. So this isn't really conducting groundbreaking research. It's simply like scienceifying something I could have told you for free. They're just logical conclusions. So this overemphasis on applying scientific methods to common sense understandings, I don't think is actually doing science. It's just wasting time and using up some valuable resources that could be put into other forms of research. The scientific method isn't valuable because it confirms information we already know. Its utility comes from its ability to reveal unexpected relationships. But this can only be achieved through the OG scientific method, which is experimentation. So let's talk about experiments. Hopefully we all know that experiments work by systematically controlling and manipulating variables in order to detect cause and effect relationships. And this works extremely well in closed systems, which is what natural science tends to study. But this completely falls apart when applied to social ones. Why is this the case? Well, it has to do with the objects of inquiry. As it turns out, people are a little bit different than rocks or rats or nuclear reactors. We are conscious agents, and the content of our mind matters. Our memories, interpretations, and expectations all play meaningful roles in determining our behavior. So you can't conduct the same experiment on the same person twice, but you also can't make comparisons between subjects either. Controlling for external sociological factors doesn't diminish psychological or biological ones, it amplifies them. So what I'm trying to get at is that there's a fundamental difference in kind, which separates the social world from the natural realm. People are self-interpreting and value-oriented agents. Not only do a multiplicity of factors motivate any given decision, but people are often highly unaware of what those factors are or could be. Practicing social science requires operationalizing variables which are, by definition, subjective and context dependent. Unlike objective qualities like weight or temperature, there is no way you can measure a concept such as happiness or anxiety, never mind a metric that would allow you to compare subjective experiences across individuals. Unlike the natural sciences, where the objects of inquiry are independent from the aspirations of the researcher, social science both defines and influences social reality. A good example of this would be the rise in discussions about mental health over the past few years. The rise in conversations about mental health causes people to introspect and potentially identify mental health issues in themselves, causing reporting to go up and more people to be discussing it. So it becomes a self-perpetuating feedback loop. The second major problem in social science is that it's impossible to isolate any phenomena down to a specific cause and effect relationship between two variables. Scientific experimentation relies upon closed systems wherein one variable can be manipulated at a time while controlling for all others. Being able to exercise perfect control over passive agents is what allows a scientific method to produce predictive and replicable results. However, people are much more complex than the objects of natural scientific study. Their actions are informed by a lifetime of experiences, expectations, interpretations, and biological mechanisms. Human behavior is something like a black box. There may be inputs and outputs, but there's so much happening on the neuropsychosociological level that cannot easily be tracked or accounted for. It would be highly unethical to conduct a study which would attempt to control for all of these factors. And even then, people have unique genetic predispositions, which would only be augmented by controlling for other variables. So given the fact that a near infinite amount of potential confounds is at play, it becomes nearly impossible to falsify a given claim. For a scientific theory to be valid, it must be disprovable. However, a theory tested through social research can always attribute failure to the existence of a confounding variable to justify an unfavorable result. So while many social scientists would readily admit that their findings are not nearly as precise, predictive, or objective as their natural scientific counterparts, few recognize that their research may actually be doing more harm than good. There seems to be a disconnect between the philosophy of social science, which acknowledges this fundamental difference in kind, and the practice of social science, which remains committed to a scientific ideal. The problem with social science is that it seeks to draw a direct one-to-one causal relationship between phenomena, rather than examining how a complex set of interactions lead to the emergence of social behavior. There is never a single universal law at play, and any attempt to define such rules is only a partial truth, overlooking how a multiplicity of events is required to shape social action. Therefore, any fact distiller from social research threatens to oversimplify and obscure the more nuanced aspects of social reality. Um, I also want to make it clear that when I'm talking about social sciences, I'm specifically referring to research that seeks to demonstrate causal relationships between two socially constructed variables. So this leaves plenty of room for meaningful scientific research to be conducted in the realms of like biology or neurology. Clearly, we can conduct brain imaging research that correlates different brain areas with mental states or test phenomena such as reaction time or memory. This sort of research is still more difficult because there's still these confounding variables at play, but at least it's tethered to some objective measures of reality. The real problems arise when you start comparing purely socially constructed variables. So, for instance, like a country's economic policies and its self-reported happiness of the citizens, there's no objective measure that you can tether anything to. Um, so an example of this might be like if you've got two people that are debating the merits of capitalism versus communism, both sides would insist that a true version of their economic system hasn't been tried. So they wouldn't be persuaded by appeals to available evidence unless it's going to support their claims that they're already making. Ultimately, it's our values which inform our interpretation of the world. Scientific evidence is only used as an anchor to legitimize our pre-existing beliefs. Um, Feelings don't care about your facts. The intelligibility of any argument relies upon some shared value orientations. And this is what I think I want to shift the focus of our discussions onto. We must appeal to people's emotional intuitions if we want to persuade them to hold a certain point of view. So if you go back to that capitalist communist example, I think everyone would agree we don't want to support an economic system that leads to the mass starvation of millions of people. if that's more likely to emerge from a capitalist system or a communist one remains up for debate, but at least you're grounding the discussion in some shared values rather than some idea of some scientific basis that isn't actually grounded in as much facts as you'd think it is. So we can investigate how we get to these starting valued principles later, but first we must recognize that we're being motivated by certain value orientations. People are much more likely to be persuaded by arguments that appeal to reason and shared ideals, rather than simply citing facts sourced through supposedly scientific studies. And then I guess I'll just end on the idea that I think there's a false assumption that our knowledge increases with available information. And I think the problem nowadays is that our institutions are focused on generating lots of information, but not so much knowledge to frame and integrate that information into a persuasive social theory, which should be the ultimate goal. That's about all I have to say on the topic. I know we're about to go into a discussion and then I won't be able to talk for 20 minutes, but if anyone's got any bones to pick with what I'm saying, I'm very interested. My suggestion would be, see if you can come up with some scientific study that you think is really persuasive in the social realm, obviously, and can you not kind of attack it from some angle where you see, well, maybe this isn't actually supporting the claim it says it is, there's some inconsistency here, or if you think it's really great, a great example of research, then I'd be very interested to check that out. But yeah, I think that's about it, Peter.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jane. So now in a moment, we're going to engage in a brief meditation, and then I will break the meditation. And after I break that meditation, we'll engage in a group conversation without the record button on. And we're going to lean on the collective presencing method we practice here on Friday. So basically, whenever you're called to speak, just unmute yourself and speak whatever feels most alive for you. And this session is scheduled for 2 hours, but we may end earlier than that. And you can leave anytime you want. No need to say goodbye to the group, just sneak out. So there's one hard rule, and Jane just alluded to it. I'll put it in the chats. Our guest will stay silent for the first 20 minutes, and no one can ask them a question directly during that duration. I will tag them in silently after the 20-minute mark via private message. At that point, they can join the conversation if they're called to join it. And there's 3 guidelines I'd like us to follow. I'll post them in the chat. Say what you believe to be true. This is what we do here all the time at the Stoa anyways. Do not police the conversation. Don't concern yourself if it's going off topic, because it will go off topic if we're speaking to what is most alive for us. Allow it to go wherever it wants to go. If someone says something radically like off topic, quote unquote, they will probably just be ignored, and then the collective will turn it back to the topic at hand. And be sensitive to the last one, share the conversational airspace. Be sensitive to the fact that there are other people in the room, and some people might really want to share something and have something to share, but there's certain people that kind of are loquacious and hogging up the conversational airspace. So be sensitive to that within. So that being said, I will stop recording in a moment, and I recommend everyone has their camera on. And if you want to leave at this portion, feel free. But is there any clarifying questions in anything I just said? If there is, you can just unmute yourself and ask it. So I'll give a moment for this. And Jane, they're asking for your link. So if you feel free to pop that in the chat anytime. All right, so maybe give me some thumbs up if everyone feels kind of understood and understand what's going on here. Okay, cool. I am going to turn off the recording now, and this will get posted on YouTube, which would be cool, but then the conversation won't be, is bringing out juicy with our thinking. All right.